She is on our coaching panel. Her packages are there and available for you to purchase. But in the first instance, as all of our coaches, she does offer a free kind of chemistry building conversation. So if anything resonates with you tonight and you want a further conversation, then please do utilize that, reach out to her, and yeah, kind of get the conversation starting. So I want to keep my introduction quite brief, because I want to make sure we make use of the time. So I'll pass straight over to you, Alessandra, and thank you so much.
It is my pleasure. I am going to share my screen because otherwise I will forget, and then I will do my best to even remember that I need to change slides down there. Okay, I'm actually really excited to be here, and the truth of this presentation is that I created it at the beginning of the pandemic, when clients of mine and leaders in my community started reaching out because of my background as a psychologist and saying, how do we lead? How do we lead in this space? The good thing is, and I wrote about this morning on LinkedIn, you don't have to wait for a pandemic to figure out how to lead in a crisis, because we face dozens of crises on any given day, and any given month. And you could think of things like your supply chain being broken, or an angry client. Or I heard recently of an organization that had to put something on hold because one of their leaders suddenly died. It was a car or a biking accident, I think. It's small things, just like having to change an office, or when a referendum changes how your economy is operating, or in the case of Texas right now, a massive snowstorm that they were not expecting, right? So the thing about being able to manage in crisis is that, or lead in crisis, is that is something that you set up in good times. And one of my favorite things to do to understand how to be the best kind of leader we want to be in crisis, and leadership is not something that comes with a title. Leadership is entirely about how you show up, right? I am a leader in my household, so I have to manage this crisis. As a mother and as CEO of my household, don't tell my husband I position myself as CEO of the household, but I am. He can be the CFO, also important. But as a business owner and as a number of other things, it's things that we prepare first and foremost. So one of the things I'd love to do, and because we have a small group, we can do it with unmuting ourselves, or if you want to right now, you can type it in the chat. But I want you to think about your best and your worst leaders. You can go all the way back to grade school. Think about the absolute worst person you've had the displeasure of having to serve under. It could be a teacher, it could be a coach, it could be a parent, it could also be a first boss. And then think about the best leaders you've ever had the privilege of serving under. And when you're thinking about best leaders, you want to think about the type of person who literally or figuratively you would follow into battle. They are who you're trying to become when you're thinking about your own leadership. And I would just like you to think about one quality that you think is associated with what made the terrible leader truly terrible, and one quality amidst many, right, for both, that made this amazing leader the amazing leader they were. And again, we can spend just a little bit of time on this, but if you want, you can unmute yourself and say, oh, the terrible leader was, the fantastic leader was, or you can go in the chat and you can put that information in the chat if you'd like. As you're thinking about this, I have asked this question to hundreds of people, because anytime I get the opportunity, to teach about leadership, I ask this question. But I've asked it, in this case, since I live in the States, to people in the Marines and in the Navy. I've asked CEOs, I've asked managers, I've asked entrepreneurs who are running their own businesses, and I've even asked, I have 2 sons, so I've even asked, their sports teams, whether it was soccer or baseball. And what you find when you ask people what makes for terrible and wonderful leaders is that the same 5 qualities tend to come up. So I talk about these as pillars of leadership And there's something I will talk about in a second. But first, and as I navigate this on my teeny screen, there, Katie wrote, bad leader, not open to change, not willing to see things from a new perspective. Bad leader leads with conflict. How about the rest of you? Crystal, I know Renata, you're cooking. So Kiki and Yoko and Anna and Gemma and Christabel. Terrible.
Yeah, sure. I'll jump in there. So yeah, it's not hard to think of a bad leader, huh? But although actually I kind of differentiate between a manager and a leader, but
they're different.
Yeah, I mean, in the past, yeah, certainly a past boss who just didn't have my back, just instantaneous throw you under the bus in a crisis. And yeah, that's certainly one. And then in terms of good leadership, they just yeah, a leader in my the company I work alongside just have that rock solid inner belief, like nothing can deter them. Like they just have this thing about them that is like, oh. So yeah.
Did they demonstrate that same belief about their teams or about the people who worked with them? Or was it just
and you can just when you if it just when you talk to them, or even if they're talking to an external, they just have that same aura about them, and whatever you throw at them, they just have that that rock solid.
Those people are really easy to trust, right? Building confidence in people like that. And you'll see when we talk about our 3 C's, this is going to come up. Gemma says worst leaders, and I think it's fascinating, right? A lot of us we jump in with that worst leader first because it's so absolutely terribly painful to have to operate and to be stuck under the leadership of a terrible leader, right? The impact of terrible leaders are catastrophic. So if you are thinking about your own leadership, and again, leadership does not come with titles. We all know people with the titles of leader who were terrible. These are the people you're thinking of currently. Leadership is something you demonstrate in the way you think about a situation, in the way you approach situations and problems. But it is to be trapped under the stewardship of somebody who is labeled as a leader, but who is terrible at doing it is soul crushing, right? And really destructive to personal ego and then to teams and to agencies. So as you think about how to manage or how to lead, I don't know why I keep on saying manage, because you're right, Crystal, they're completely different skill sets. How to lead in crisis. What I want you to think about is, how do I show up as the best leader, not the worst leader? The thing with great leadership is the key to retention, right? And we all know this because great leaders are what convince people to come into the office every single day or to walk into an organization every single day and show up even in bad times. And great retention is actually the key to great recruitment. So the more an organization can demonstrate that the people who work there love working there, the more they're going to attract. And they're going to attract the best kind of people. So there's a lot of value. I mean, I know a lot of companies and organizations focus on recruit. And I'm always telling leaders, no, you have to figure out what you need to do to retain the people. Often, if I'm talking to them, it's the women, right? Retain the women who are currently working for you. You make sure those women are walking in, are happy, are able to do the things that they want to do. And you are going to start recruiting the top talent. So as I said, when I talk about leadership and worst and best leaders, right? Oftentimes people will give 20, 30 different qualities. But when you look at those qualities, they actually come down to 5 pillars of leadership that I want to share with you today, because I want you to think about them. And as we talk about how to lead in crisis, I'll bring those crisis leadership skills back down to these actual 5 fundamental leadership pillars that you need to have at all times. I wish I had a list of my slides, because you'll see that because I talk pretty organically about this, I might not entirely follow the slides. But this comes down to what we were saying before about the cost of terrible leadership, which is demoralization, burnout, and disengagement, which nobody can afford in a time of crisis. So if you think about these 5 pillars of great leadership, the very first one to consider is great leaders are strategic, value-based thinkers. So if you're considering your role as a leader, and if you're considering how as a leader you can show up at your best in good times, but especially in bad times, one of the most important things you have to identify are what are the values that underpin your leadership? And what are the principles that are derived from those values? And then beyond that, because I'm a coach and because I think about action and I think about change, what are the behaviors that are going to allow you to express those values and to stay true to those principles? So as we talk, same thing in the chat, what I'd like you to do is really think about, when I talk to women about this quality, I say, think about it in terms of your legacy. What do you want to be known for? Right? Those are your values. So I might say one of my biggest values is to show up true to myself, right? And that is something I expect of the people who work with me. And the more I grow Life in Focus, right, when it becomes a 10, 50 person organization, this is going to be one of the values that I want to underpin my organization. One of the principles, and I can think of principles nearly as like commandments or rules, that derives from that is speak up, say what you mean what you say, right? And I've talked about that for E2W, right? When I came to London a few years ago, and the importance of speaking up. And then the behaviors might be to share my opinions, to make sure I voice my dissent, to work very hard on not censoring my style. I am not a corporate woman. I do not come across in a corporate style. And when I try to play that role, I undermine my effectiveness, right? So those are the very specific behaviors that allow me to make sure that I'm adhering to this principle, which is to speak up, to say what I mean what I say, which is an embodiment of the larger value. So great leaders, first and foremost, are very clear about what values underpin their leadership and about the principles and the behaviors that are associated with that. And they're strategic in how they look at things. We'll talk when it comes to crisis leadership about how the strategic vision is essential. But basically, if you're not strategic, you're reactive. There is no middle ground. I am not very black and white about things in life, but on this one, I have to be. If you are not strategic, you're being reactive. And reactivity doesn't work in the best of times, and it is catastrophic in a crisis to be reactive. If as a leader, you have a strong sense of where you want to go, what you want to do, the way in which you want to show up, then the value of that at any point in time in your business or in your professional life is consistency and predictability. So leaders who show up as strategic value-based thinkers are people who set a clear vision and framework for their team and are people who allow their team to be fairly certain of how to operate even in the absence of their leader. Right? So we create this consistency, which is so important to leadership. The next pillar of leadership that I see come up again and again and again is the one most people start with, which is team focused, right? What a great leader understands is a team is not simply a collection of a bunch of individuals, right? Who are supposed to work together to get a project or a task done. A leader understands that a team is a collection of individuals who each have specific skills, specific strengths and weaknesses, and they understand how you bring those strengths and weaknesses together to the advantage of the individual, to the advantage of the team, to allow the whole to produce a better product, whatever that product is, whether it's a service or it's actually a widget, or whether it's an impact on the world, right? Great team leaders understand that when a team fails, they are responsible for that failure. as leaders. But when a team succeeds, although they should, and I believe this, and I think it's especially important for us to remember as women, it is important that if you are managing or leading a team and your team succeeds, to take some credit for that success. But the majority of the credit and the majority of the focus for that credit has to go on the individuals within the team. Right? And in doing that, what they do is they create loyalty. Right? And again, by understanding who the people on your team are and how they work well together, you position yourself to be able to have to extract the greatest talent from the people who are with you. And what we know about human beings is when we can walk into a space day in, day out, and feel like we are impactful and feel like we're allowed to shine and feel like that is recognized, we are engaged. And if we're engaged, we work harder. And if we're engaged, we go further. And if we're engaged, we stay, right? So this is, again, a huge piece of retention, which then leads to recruitment, but also productivity and happiness at work. I don't think anybody starts off wanting to create a company where people are miserable, but I think a lot of people end up at that point. Right? As individual leaders, we have an opportunity to change that. Sometimes we don't get to change that for a whole organization or for the whole company, but maybe we get to change it for the people who we have influence over. And if that's only 2 people, well, then you've just made 2 people's 8 hours a day, 8 to 10 in finance, hours a day, 5 days a week, 48 weeks a year. So much better, right? In addition to being team focused, great leaders are individual champions, meaning, and I take Bob Iger here. I know Bob Iger was CEO of Disney, wasn't CEO of Disney, came back as CEO of Disney. I'm actually really not clear where he's at in the Disney chain of things, but he has some really fantastic quotes about leadership. And under his stewardship, Disney has really evolved. But one of the things that he put out there was this idea that a great leadership at its essence is not about being indispensable. It's about making sure that you prepare other people to step into your shoes. And so great leaders are going to identify who on their team is the strongest person. And they're not going to be threatened by that person's strength. They're not going to suppress or hold back that person. They're going to do whatever they can to mentor and sponsor and elevate them, realizing that, again, if you've done your job as a leader, you will create so much loyalty that that person is not going to take your job. They might leave for a competitor, but then now you've built a relationship. Because now you have somebody else in a position of leadership in another organization who knows, understands, respects, and values you. There's partnership that's created from that. Terrible leaders, if you think about it, very often are threatened by talent on their team. Terrible leaders do things, and I see this happen all the time with women, where they identify that one woman who's a Wonder Woman, or that those 10 women who are Wonder Women on their teams, and they realize that without those women, their facade of effectiveness and efficiency and productivity crumbles. So instead of promoting those women, they just keep them in place because they're their workhorses, right? And eventually, and most women, especially most hardworking, driven, talented women, will take that for a period of time. And then one day they'll leave because everybody has a breaking point, right? So that harkens back to what I had talked about back in, oh my goodness, 2019, spring of 2019, last time I was in London. This should go without saying, and I cannot believe it's the 4th pillar that I put out there. It really should be the first one, but great leaders lead. It is terrible how many leaders actually don't lead. And what I mean by this is great leaders are decisive. Great leaders take action. Great leaders, figuratively, and in the spaces I speak, sometimes quite literally, are the first ones into battle and the last ones out of the burning building. They are willing to have difficult conversations. They are willing to make decisions that are unpopular with their teams or with individuals if they realize that those decisions are for the benefit of the whole, right? And so this willingness to take action and to do it well is predicated in part to that first pillar of being strategic, because otherwise you're reactive. And what we often see with poor leaders is that they're decent in good times, but in bad times, they go MIA. They start missing in action. They become very passive. They abdicate responsibility and put other people in charge of decision-making because they don't want to make the mistake. So they do the opposite of what Uncle Ben told Peter Parker, which is, they forget that with great power comes great responsibility. They want all the power and none of the responsibility. So if you're thinking of stepping up into leadership, this is probably the most uncomfortable place for most of us, which is, again, this idea of being decisive and stepping in, and sometimes not making decisions by committee, right? And having to be that person who is potentially going to get a negative label, but that strategically the decisions you're making are the best for the long term. So again, the reason we're going over best practices for leadership is being a great leader in a time of crisis is not something that just happens. It has to be built on a foundation of great leadership in good times. And these 5 pillars there are a lot of specific behaviors that fall under these 5 pillars, but these 5 pillars are what I keep on being told, right? So not just academically what somebody's measuring, but what people who have faced terrible and great leaders are saying matter most to them. And then, as it just so happens, the research out there on leadership tends to support these. But when I created them, it was based on talking to people about their experience. The last one is one that maybe is more innate. So when people talk about leadership as something that you're born with, maybe this is part of the born with piece. I actually believe leadership is a skill, and therefore it can be developed, honed, and perfected. But the last thing is great leaders have great personal character. I am talking about things that we are going to get to in just a few minutes with regards to crisis leadership, which is they're honest and they're clear and they're vulnerable and they're accountable and they take ownership. Right? Some of these are things that you can learn, like learning how to be accountable, learning how to take feedback, learning how to take ownership. Seem like they should be intuitive and innate skills, but I work on teaching women how to do that all the time, how to get feedback, how to be told you messed up, and just sit there and evaluate where the truth lies in that and what you want to do with it and where it doesn't, and then how to put that out into the world without fearing that because you made a mistake, people are going to deem you incompetent. Right? These are skills. So great personal character is the last pillar of leadership. And if you look at your list, I bet you some of it, that idea of being self-centered. Poor leaders are self-centered. Well, being outwardly focused is part of having great character, having empathy, caring about people. That is part of character. There are skills that go with that fall into being the team player. And I'm looking over flexibility is a character thing, right? Being open to new ideas, being open to novelty is a character thing. So the question is, and let me call this, you have to ask yourself, based on these 5 pillars, based on what you know of yourself, what kind of leader do you think you would be in a time of crisis? And I'm very curious because I know nothing about your backgrounds, ladies. Who in our group is actually in a position currently of leadership? Let's say officially or unofficially. Anna says she is. I know Katie is. And I know a lot of everybody else is. Your videos are off, which is fine. But if you want to go in the chat, I'm really curious. And again, I run a company now of 2. But even when I ran a company of 1, I would have said I'm in a position of leadership. First of all, I have to lead my company of 1 to go where it needs to go. But I also lead a family. For a long time, I was on the board of a school and I was president of that board. So I guess I was a leader in that space, although I stepped down because I was not allowed to really step in as a leader. And so I didn't want to be a figurehead. So when you think about this leadership, You know, if you're running a business, if you have a family, you might be a leader in your community. You might be a leader among your friends. You might be that person that people look to. So you can then think about, we can use the pandemic because it's the most recent, huge crisis. But you can think about, well, how did you step up when that happened? How did you show up for your friends? If we're just talking about leadership in that position, in that role, it's fine. The thing with leadership in a crisis is that you're going to be using those 5 pillars, and then you're going to really be focusing on three additional skills. And Katie, I noticed that you unmuted yourself. Did you have something you wanted to share?
I guess, you know, being a leader at E2W, but also, you know, to the wider community, especially during COVID, as you said, as the crisis, the first thing that I wanted to do was make sure that I as a, you know, E2W stepped up for our community. And I think that is how I see myself as a leader, being, you know, for the many. And I think that quite often I lack the more authoritative and that kind of side of leadership, because I've got that more empathetic and, I want to say, nurturing, but in a, you know, kind of business capacity. I just really care about, you know, people in the organisation. So, but I've identified that, and I think the best piece of advice, or the best thing I was ever told about leadership, and you have to excuse the swearing, but shit rolls downhill. That's and I've always taken that on board and thought, yes, if there's, your leader is in crisis, or if your leader is you know, under pressure, it often falls down to the team, and that's not how I want to present myself.
Yeah, I think that's very accurate, you know. And here's the thing, you I have to call you out on this, because you nearly apologized for having nurturing as a primary quality of your leadership. But as women, we lead very differently than men, and there's nothing wrong with that. It's complementary. And actually, what we're finding in times of crisis is organizations and nations that are led by women seem to be doing slightly better. I'm not saying men can't lead. Clearly, they've gotten us through this much at this point, right? I'm just saying there is value to leading differently. And when we look at female leadership, A, it tends to be more collaborative. B, actually what we tend to find is that female leadership is more, what's the word? There's a very specific word for it, which I probably will not remember right now, since I want to remember it. But basically it adapts to circumstances. And if any of you remember what the word, there's a very specific word in leadership speak for that. But female leaders tend to modify and adapt their leadership style to specific issues and audiences. And that flexibility, that agility is really, really powerful, right? As long as, I would argue, that it's underpinned by our first pillar. So a strong sense of what your values are, of what your principles are, of how you want to show up in a strategic vision. Otherwise, it just becomes reactive, right? Anna, you said you're in a position of leadership.
Yeah, so I'm the president of the Alumni Association of my university here in London. So I went to school in Canada, and I am the president here.
How was your leadership called upon during the crisis?
Well, I was just, I guess, looked for a direction as to what we were going to do. I think really what the association does is hold events to keep the alumni community engaged. So usually that means having in-person events, and, well, you know, just organizing the drinks, the networking events and whatnot. So I think for us, really the challenge was that, well, we all have full-time jobs, so it's a bit difficult to kind of be juggling full-time jobs along trying to also have events when nobody really wants to have more Zoom events. Yeah, no, I mean, these ones obviously are still quite nice, but in a way, I think the networking part really suffered a lot from going digital, because it just becomes so much more awkward than it would be otherwise. So I think I was just looked at to see what we were going to do, were we going to do anything. And I think really, well, in that case, I actually had to step back and let the university kind of take it a bit more digital, because in the end, it's really their job more than mine. And it was a good opportunity to do more of a global type of approach rather than the localized one that we provided because we were on the ground. So in that case, I guess my step was just to take a bit of a step back because it was kind of a bigger challenge than full-time working professionals were ready to take on.
Yeah, I mean, it was such a hard thing to navigate, right? You mentioned just even networking. Networking is such an important part of actually building a career, proper networking and building social capital. And a lot of us had to adapt, and not just as individuals, but as organizations, how to provide that same value virtually. E2W did this, right? And did it well. And then for the rest of us, it was like, well, how do I show up? How do I show up and sip a glass of wine on screen and have it look normal and not like I'm a lush? And then also, how do I have these conversations when at the end of the day, my eyes hurt, my throat is dry, I'm tired of looking at a screen, and there's chaos in the background, which is the way the end of my days look, at least. So when you think about leadership specifically in crisis, the good news is if you have your 5 pillars set up, you're starting very, very well. And then there's 3 extra pillars that you want to lean on, and to make them catchy and easy to remember, we made them alliterations. They're all C's, right? And the first C is clarity. And you can think again about this current crisis, or you can think about how Brexit might be really upending your economic space, or you can think about the last time your company had a merger, or for those of you who are in business for yourself, you can think about any of the dozens of crises a business owner has to face, right? And disseminating that information. The very, very first thing a great leader does in crisis is disseminate information. The thing with human beings is under stress and under high levels of stress, we tend to shift very rapidly into some form of fight or flight. And under fight or flight, what your brain does is it basically reverts back to an evolutionarily adaptive processing mode. And that processing mode is be reactive, be ready quite literally to fight off a predator or evade a danger. So when you're really anxious and you notice that your mouth goes dry, well, part of the reason that happens is your digestive process is shutting down, because the last thing you need to be doing is digesting food and needing to use the bathroom when you're trying to fight off a predator. That's also the reason why under really, really high levels of stress, people might void their bowels or their bladder, right? That's a fight or flight response. That need is taken care of. Now we can run or fight, right? The reason our muscles get tense, our necks and everything, is because we're gearing up to defend ourselves from a punch or from an assault. And so we brace ourselves. But when you're seated at your desk and you're looking at the 15th meeting on your calendar in 3 days, and you're really not facing, an actual danger or predator, you might not realize that just that slight tension of your shoulders is not just because your desk and your keyboard aren't properly set up. It's you bracing yourself for more danger, for more stress. So the problem is cognitively, what happens under fight or flight is your frontal cortex that is there to process complex information and for advanced decision-making starts downgrading its functions, right? So that you can be more in that reactive instinctual space, which means we don't process data and information very, very well. So it is essential for really good leaders in times of crisis to be able to present necessary information as clearly and as concisely as possible. The beauty with clarity is it bypasses that fight or flight place. But the other thing is, when you think about anxiety, think of anxiety as this interplay. I wonder if I have. The anxiety is this interplay between perceived danger and perceived control, right? So when you're faced with the situation where you perceive a high incidence of danger and you don't feel like you have very much control, a pandemic, the world is shutting down, right? And there's nothing I can do about it. There's this vacuum, there's a space within which high levels of anxiety can bloom. By being clear, by coming and disseminating important and essential information rapidly, what a leader can do is increase your sense of control. They can do nothing sometimes about the actual danger you're facing, but by increasing your sense of control, they reduce your anxiety, your stress, and your danger. So the first step as a great leader in times of crisis is trying to develop clarity. What that means for you specifically as a leader is learn to speak to the issues, right? It might seem blunt, but remove as much fluff as you can. Be mindful that in fight or flight, people cannot process information. Just think of the last time you heard some bad medical news, right? We know this in the medical field. When you break bad medical news to people, they process about 20% of the information you give them. So you might have a physician who's trying to make sure you have all the information you need, and you're listening to them and you think you've got it. And then you turn around to somebody else later on who said, well, what did they say? And you realize, well, they said that there was something, they threw a clot. I have a cat who just threw a clot, right? And I thought I got it all. And then I spoke to my husband. I'm like, they said something about he's having a heart issue and he threw a clot, and something about its legs not working. And he's like, why would its legs not work? It has to do with the vascular system of a cat versus a human, by the way. Humans throw clots up, cats throw clots down, cuts the circulation to the legs, apparently. But it was recently, because it was this week, such a prime evidence of our inability to process information when we are stressed. The other thing, which I'm terrible at, I will admit this, is keep it short. Right? Speak to the issues, keep it short, stay on point. And then very, very important, make sure that you address your next steps. Okay? So if I'm going to disseminate information to my team about something that's going on, I want to say, this is what's happening. This is what I know and don't know. This is what we're going to do next. Sometimes you don't know what the next step is going to be. So you articulate that. Our next step is going to be figuring out what our next step needs to be. We just do not have that information right now. And I would argue, when possible, provide a timestamp of some kind. Give people an ETA. Because if people are waiting for information and the space is open, again, there's a lot of space for us to feel anxious. If I can just come in and know, my CEO walked in and he said, we're trying to figure out how to do this. There are going to be furloughs. There are going to be layoffs. They're not sure yet who's going to be furloughed or laid off. That information will be provided in 2 weeks. Well, at least I know not to ask for 2 weeks. At least I know for the next 2 weeks I have a job, right? At least I know that for the next 2 weeks I can plan financially in a certain way. If I don't put that last piece of information, then every single day I'm waking up wondering, is it me? Is it today? Right? Like, I can't do any planning. So clarity is your first step. The second C of crisis leadership is confidence. And in this case, confidence plays out in 2 ways. One is something all of you alluded to earlier. It's about making sure that you've taken the steps so that your team, your organization, your community, your family, whoever you're leading, has confidence in you, trusts you. Right? When you have those values set up and you've been consistent, when you've shown up as a true team player, when you've demonstrated over the course of your leadership that you truly lead, that you can make difficult decisions, have those uncomfortable conversations, that you will sacrifice when you need to sacrifice. Simon Sinek has a great book. If you have not read it, I highly recommend it. It's called Leaders Eat Last. And his whole point is that in good times, leaders historically always eat first, and they get the choice pieces of meat. Because in bad times, leaders feed everybody in their village before they themselves eat. Right? If you have demonstrated that through those initial pillars, then when things get difficult, when you have to admit during one of your clarity sessions that you don't know what's going on, that you don't have a plan yet, that times are going to be rough, your team will trust you. They will trust you because they know that you're even keeled. They will trust you because they understand that your vision is strategic. They will trust you because they understand that you are not a reactive leader, right? And just because you don't know doesn't mean you won't figure it out. So that confidence piece is huge. The nice thing with crisis is that sometimes it's the best opportunity to demonstrate confidence. So here, I live in San Diego, California, which, and I don't expect anybody to know this necessarily, but it's very close to Las Vegas, Nevada. It's a 45-minute airplane ride. It's, in American terms, this is a short drive. It's a 5-hour drive. It's like a 10-hour drive when there's traffic, but without traffic, it's like a 4 or 5-hour drive. And the way a lot of the casinos handled the pandemic was really impressive. The Wynn Casino specifically, which was one of the bigger casinos out here, shut down their casinos, but continued paying all of their employees, including tips. So they figured out how much the employees were getting in tips, and they paid them. They didn't furlough anybody, right? And they took steps in their leadership to really develop the confidence of their teams, right? That might mean that the people at the higher levels weren't getting any bonuses, which makes sense. Why would we be giving bonuses during a difficult year? That it meant that some of the people in higher leadership weren't actually getting salaries because they had, enough of a base salary from previous years that they could do without. There are other companies here where what people did is people were pulled. My husband works in a hospital, so I know all the physicians took a 10 to 12% salary cut to make sure that the people who really needed their salaries and couldn't afford the cuts, right? The physician's assistants, the janitorial services, the nurses, that none of them got it, right? So we have opportunities in a crisis really to develop the confidence of others through our actions. But if you've prepared well, you come into crisis with that confidence. There's a second piece to the confidence element, and I'm actually curious if you've experienced this. Great leaders in times of crisis not only leverage the trust that they've built, but they demonstrate trust and confidence in their teams. Right? And this is extremely important to understand that as a leader, you cannot do it all. So you have to know your people well enough, and you have to trust them to be able to stand by your side. That's going to require you to delegate, to talk to disseminate information at different levels. And I'm wondering, for those of you now who've had leaders over you, right? So not you as a leader, did you experience this during a time of crisis, whether it's the pandemic or any other crisis? Have you had the privilege of having a leader who, in time of crisis, really demonstrated their confidence, their trust in you? And what was that like? Go, Katie. You know you were going to be the first one.
I'm sure he'll watch the recording, so let me just talk about Mark. No, to be fair, over the last year, as a really small business, at the beginning of the crisis, it was, we were worried. But the first thing that Mark did was kind of, prove that confidence, show us that confidence to say, okay, and it was short term, Alessandra, like you said, 2 weeks, it was short term, right, for the next 2 weeks, focus on X, Y, and Z, and let's catch up. And as to your point, it allowed us to not focus too much on the what ifs, but okay, we have to do this to get through. Obviously, we came out the other side, and it's been a very positive experience, for the company. But it was so important at that time that the leader took control and kind of, deflected that confidence onto us in a sense. It wasn't left, us talking amongst ourselves, kind of panicking about gosh, who's going to be furloughed first, or, you know, cuts here and there, because it was just nipped right in the bud. And I think it's kind of the turnaround as well after crisis. You shouldn't leave it too long before you have these conversations.
Yeah. Yeah. Crystal, you unmuted yourself too.
Yeah, just actually just following on from Katie's point, I think very much speed is of the essence. I do actually run my own business, but I work alongside others as well, and certainly the leader that I have, he's had 20 plus years in the industry, and at the time I was actually thinking about just quitting because I could just see, but he really instilled so much confidence in me, kind of almost took me aside under his wing, and that's just what I needed. So I was like, shit, like I'm actually contemplating walking away from this. Mm-hmm. So we had a very frank and candid discussion. So yeah, that's just exactly what I needed just at that time. So yeah.
It's so important. And I noticed, so just ladies, so you know, the only people I can see on my screen, because I have this in the background, are myself, Katie, Crystal, Anna, and I see Tara's placeholder. So if anybody else wants to speak, just unmute yourself and say your name, because I won't necessarily see it the way I noticed with Katie and Crystal, the unmuting. I think it's really important. And for those of you who are business owners, it is equally important, right? Again, as leaders in our organizations, I know that when the pandemic hit, my first reaction was panic. I went up to a friend of mine who works for herself, and I have two businesses. I have my therapy practice, which is a teeny portion of my business now, but at the time it was the biggest portion of my business. And I have this coaching, speaking, consulting, life and focus. And I went up to my friend and I said, I'm going to lose both of my businesses, right? Who is going to pay for a coach if they're not certain if they're going to make money? What company is going to invest in DEI and training and women? This is an excuse for many companies to just stop doing it. They have I'm a little jaded, but I was like, this is the excuse they've been waiting for. Sorry, isn't a priority. We need to focus on like shareholder gains, right? And there was panic and there was fear. And the idea was, in this case, just having somebody else who just looked at me and said, you've got this. Right? And then I happened to have a coach of my own. So I spoke to him, panicked. And he said, well, what's your plan? Right. And because we had a strategic vision for that year, because those things were in place, I was able to say, okay, same plan, different approach. And for me, I'm very lucky. Actually, 2020 was the best year in my business. Right. And part of it was starting off with going, okay, I said I wanted to speak more. And I'd go up to people. I'm like, let's talk about crisis leadership. Let's talk about stress management. Let's do, right? So I really want you to think about this, both when you're evaluating your leaders for their quality and crisis, but also when you're thinking about your own leadership. It does not need to be within a large organization. It's how you show up as a leader for a friend, for a fellow professional, for a family member. But have you established the foundation of trust that allows them to have confidence in you? And are you demonstrating a confidence in them, which will allow them to pull through the crisis? Right? Okay, last pillar. This one is near and dear to me. The confidence, right? You want to be clarity, be honest, be consistent, and follow through. So clarity is actually going to allow you to continue developing confidence from or trust from your team. Honesty is a really big piece. I think the leaders who do the best are the ones who can come in and say, I'm scared. I don't understand what's going on either. I don't know what I'm going to do, right? I know there's a lot of concern that in showing that level of vulnerability, we actually open ourselves up to people thinking we don't know what we're doing. But I think if it's done with poise and with some kind of articulation of a plan behind it, that actually it makes people trust us much more. The follow-through piece is this: if you say you're going to do something, do it. right? And if you can't do it for one reason or another, then follow through with a conversation with somebody on how and why you're not going to follow through with your initial plan, and explanation for why that plan isn't going to work. But this next piece for me, the C, is compassion. I kept on talking in the first few months of this pandemic to women who were drowning in work. They were drowning in work. Those who were mothers were also drowning in the responsibility of being educators suddenly and managing, their children's stress. But even without a child to worry for, people were drowning in work, and they were drowning in their own anxiety and their own worry, and worrying about their family members far and wide. I grew up in France, so I have not seen my mother since Christmas of 2019, I think. And what they were getting from leadership was, listen, we understand. We really understand these are tough times, these are difficult, everybody's adjusting. And then that got followed with a but. But as we just mentioned, these are tough times and everybody needs to rally. And so we really, really need you just to step up. And that might mean that, and for a lot of these women, that meant that they were starting work at 5 a.m., not getting up at 5 a.m. to go to work, like turning on their computers and starting work at 5 a.m. and not getting home at 7 p.m., but continuing to work at 7 p.m. and then having dinner. And if they did have children, putting the children to sleep and back on their computers only to be back up at 5. It meant that despite exceptional circumstances, the expectations that were placed on these women in terms of numbers and output were not being adjusted, right? Compassion is empathy plus the genuine desire to alleviate or relieve stress, to make somebody's life better. In crisis, leaders have to understand how to not just demonstrate empathy, because empathy without compassion feels empty. It feels like words. And this was a gripe I had with many, many, many companies and leaders, is that they did not adjust their expectations to match and address the circumstances. They wanted the same numbers, the same sales, the same output, and there were the same kind of consequences for not meeting those numbers, despite the situation and the context being completely different. So showing compassion means having empathy and care. It's adjusting those expectations. In the beginning of the pandemic specifically, but I think regardless of what crisis is showing up, it's learning how to be flexible, right? And one of the best ways to show compassion is to ask people directly, what do you need? What could make things better? And then to actively figure out how to respond to those needs immediately, even if it's in the smallest of ways. Being a leader is difficult, but it is a skill. Anybody can learn how to be a great leader. Anybody. Right? If you want to start today to be a great leader, think about those 5 pillars and start there. And simply start by determining what your values are. What do you want to be known for? What is the legacy you are going to leave? Right? If you can start there, then you can figure out how you want to articulate that in all the other 4 pillars. If you happen to be facing a crisis, which I think many of us still are, or a challenge, then on top of that, you really are going to want to focus on these 3 C's. Clarity in communicating your message and communicating what you need and what you expect. Confidence, demonstrating behaviors, values, attitudes that allow your team to trust you, but also demonstrating trust in your team and in the people who follow you to show up, right? To be helpful, not hindrances to dealing with these problems. And compassion, right? Because the reality of living with a crisis, and I chose these pictures specifically at the time, this is what I was seeing. I was seeing people losing their jobs. I was seeing women telling me that they were losing sleep. They didn't have much time to sleep, but then when they did have time to sleep, they couldn't sleep. I had people literally crying, and I will admit there were a few days there where I would end my workday, sit on my floor, and just cry in my own office. right? And then open the door and have to be available to my children and my husband and everybody else in the household. It was people watching their businesses or their markets kind of fall to pieces and trying to understand how to put it back together. But it was also pointing to this last picture in the bottom right, people who then figured out how to make it work. Right? So I hope that you don't have to face too many more crises, not big ones at least. You will face plenty of small ones. And I really, really hope that this will help you show up better as a human being and as a leader in those crises. Thank you so much for your attention and your time at the end of your workday. It does not go unappreciated or unnoticed.
Thank you. Thank you so much. That was fascinating. So many of the things you said, I was just nodding along because it just resonates so much with me. So yes, that was a fantastic session. And as I said, I know that a lot of our other members are really keen to rewatch the recording. But as I mentioned in the first half, I don't know, a couple of you have kind of joined slightly later. We're really hoping to pull together some workshops with Alessandra as well. So alongside the coaching, we're hoping to do some kind of joint work. So keep an eye out for that. Obviously, we'll advertise it all on the website and on LinkedIn. But in the meantime, if you want to reach out to her, please, use the website, get in touch and continue the conversation. So thank you so much, everyone. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much.
Thank you so much.